You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, broadcasting from Washington, D.C.
And I'm your co-host, Katie Putz, coming to you from Maryland.
Always good to be back with you, Katie. How are you doing today?
Doing great. How are you?
Doing well. International travel is beginning to pick up again, which is nice. I'm looking forward to getting back to Asia soon, actually, for the Shangri-La Dialogue, which I know we used to talk a lot about on this podcast in 2019 and prior. So it's very much going to be good to be back on the ground.
Very exciting.
Yeah, there's obviously it's going to be a great opportunity to take the pulse in the region, catch up with many friends and colleagues that I haven't seen in a long time. Of course, as many of these in-person events now returning have been a great opportunity to do.
It is good to see people.
It is. It really is. I think there's a value that's sort of ineffable to in-person interactions. At least that's my sense. In any case, let's sort of give our listeners a little bit of an overview of what we're going to chat about today. So this episode is actually, I think, a direct response to some emails and Twitter DMs I got in April, really asking us to talk about the Chinese draft agreement that leaked with the Solomon Islands, which is certainly, I think, maybe shockwaves is a little too heavy, but certainly I think spooked a lot of people in Washington. We had a U.S. delegation led by White House and State Department officials go out to the Solomon Islands in April, and some of our listeners probably haven't thought a lot about the Solomon Islands in the past because, frankly speaking, this is not a country that the United States has traditionally given a lot of attention to. But when China has a security agreement with a country in the current geopolitical environment, that tends to sort of bump you up the notch of relevancy in Washington, and I think that's certainly been the case. Of course, longer-term subscribers and listeners of the podcast might recall the discussion that we had a few months ago in late 2021 about the domestic political unrest in the Solomon Islands, which, we sort of, I think, do need to talk about the domestic component in a bit, Katie, but I think I'll leave that to you. But let me just briefly give an overview of what exactly we're talking about today. So there was a leaked draft of a security agreement between China and the Solomon Islands. So according to the reports, no journalists have, as far as I know, read the agreement or published the contents of the agreement. But according to the leaked language in that draft agreement, we don't know what the final agreement really contains. China agreed to send the People's Armed Police, military personnel, and sort of general law enforcement apparatuses to the Solomon Islands to protect sort of the livelihoods of, according to the agreement, the livelihoods of Solomon Islanders in Honiara, primarily the capital, and that the draft text also implies that China would be able to use its forces to protect Chinese personnel, and then there's been sort of longstanding concern, and this is, I think, primarily the concern in Washington, that this agreement includes a hidden or not so hidden provision for a People's Liberation Army naval base in the Solomon Islands, which is something that I think has really given the United States the most pause because traditionally, since the end of the Second World War, the U.S. has seen the Southern Pacific as a relatively uncontested area geographically, an area where the U.S. has enjoyed the influence of its allies and partners in the form of Australia and New Zealand. And so seeing China build inroads into this region is a source of concern. Now, I do want to note that the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands, Manasseh Sogavare, has rejected this idea that there's any idea of building or hosting a Chinese naval base. The dynamics here actually remind me a lot about the Cambodian denials about the Chinese naval base. The broader picture here is that over the last 10 years, China is becoming much more expeditionary with its military activities, including with the naval base in Djibouti, which was its first base overseas in general. Traditionally, China has not looked to go overseas and set up military bases, and China generally eschews alliances, as a matter of fact. Its only official treaty alliance was with North Korea, which is something that the Chinese leadership doesn't really talk about a lot these days anyways. So that's the bigger picture, which is that the Solomon Islands, a strategically important region for the United States in the Pacific, that the U.S. has gotten used to over decades, not having a major geopolitical adversary contest, is now being somewhat contested, at least if the interpretation of this agreement is that it would open the door to a Chinese naval agreement. But Katie, I think here's where we need to talk a little about the domestic political piece, because as I said in talking about the draft agreement, the big emphasis that we've sort of seen in the draft text is about this notion of law enforcement, about deploying the People's Armed Police. And don't get me wrong, that's significant in terms of what it tells us about the kinds of steps that China is willing to take to protect overseas Chinese investment and businesses. But I think to understand why this is a feature of this agreement, I think we need to rehash what happened last year in the Solomon Islands and the broader context with the Solomon Islands changing its relationship from recognizing the Republic of China or Taiwan to Beijing in 2019. So do you want to sort of bring us up to speed on the domestic piece here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if we go back to November 2021, in late November, there was a several day period in which there were riots in the Solomon Islands capital, Honiara. We discussed that in a podcast in December. So I would refer anyone back to that episode for a greater rehashing of this. But, it really pitted the opposition, which is largely rooted in the Solomon Islands' most populous island, which is Malaita, which is different from Guadalcanal, which is where Honiara is. And, the opposition was calling for the resignation of Sogavare and was criticizing his administration's China policies predominantly, in particular that 2019 switch of recognition from Taiwan to China. Peacekeepers were flown in from Australia and New Zealand, which incidentally, some of those Australian and New Zealand peacekeepers were still apparently guarding Parliament when the China deal was being announced in April. And so, the Sogavare government has, like you mentioned, said, there's no provision for a Chinese military base. The caveat is we don't actually know what's in the final draft. China does not publicize the details of its security agreements, so it's taking Sogavare at his word and taking China at their word, which I don't think they've said very much publicly about this. And Sogavare said, this deal with China doesn't negate other security agreements like those that Solomon's has with Australia and New Zealand. I thought some of his language was pretty strident. He called it utter nonsense. The quote, unfortunate perception held by many leaders that the region's security is threatened by the presence of China in the region. Now, certainly, I think as you went over some of I think we should dive into the international reactions, but there's a clear domestic division over the China issue. The opposition very firmly opposed the 2019 switch from Taiwan to China and has kind of wrapped itself around that issue. The opposition leaders were allegedly might have been the people who leaked the draft. It's unclear exactly who leaked the draft agreement, but the suspicion is heavily on the opposition. Sogavare says that this deal reflects Solomon Islands' national interests. The opposition says, this is just one step away from being a Chinese colony. I think the sort of intertwining of the international with the local dynamics is pretty interesting, but it also sets up, I think, a pretty dangerous mix in which you have the Solomon Islands government under Sogavare somewhat as a Chinese proxy and the opposition as somewhat as a U.S. proxy. I'm not saying that that's a fact. That's sort of a reading of this, is you have certainly factions within the Solomon Islands that lean toward the U.S. and factions that lean towards China on this issue. And one can imagine how that could get even more complex down the road. Say there's another large opposition protest in opposition to the government's Chinese policies, and the government calls China instead of Canberra. And then what if the Chinese what if that gets out of hand? Because among the buildings that were burned during the riots were Chinese businesses. So there are Chinese interests in the Solomons and sort of a domestic yet international facet there. So, I think this security agreement coming after that unrest, I would be super interested about the timeline. I think I read that the opposition leader, Matthew Wale, had, said that they knew about this deal last year, that it was being discussed, and I'm curious about that timeline. But I think we should bring this back to geopolitics because that's what we do here on this podcast. As much as I drag us into local politics all the time, what was your read on sort of the international reactions? The New Zealand and Australia had pretty sharp reactions. The United States
Right.
also reacted very, very interestingly. I do want to add one more sort of interesting factoid. In the United States' Indo-Pacific strategy, which was released in February, was unveiled in Fiji with a visit by Anthony Blinken. One of the things that was mentioned is the United States was aiming to reopen an embassy in the Solomon Islands, which it hasn't had since the 90s. And so you mentioned that the United States has sort of seen the Pacific as its ocean, but I think that policy highlighted that the United States hasn't been paying that much attention to the Pacific and is sort of finally waking up to the fact that active engagement is necessary.
Exactly. No, I think that's a great point. And yeah, I think in this particular case, the domestic politics of this are incredibly important in terms of understanding the geopolitical context. Because, look, to put a finer point on it, I think there's a big kind of perception gap here, which is that, okay, let me start with Salgavari, right? I think what's interesting here is that he has a clear interest in this deal, which is that having the People's Armed Police and Chinese law enforcement entities on the Solomon Islands is actually going to help him stay in power and withstand domestic unrest. And so that is sort of a very self-interested thing. And for China, I think we've talked about this a lot on the podcast. We've been doing this podcast for more than 8 years, and since the Belt and Road Initiative was announced, which was around the time I started doing this podcast. I think one of the big lessons that China has learned is that domestic political changes in many of the recipient countries for BRI grants and projects can cause trouble. I think this has happened in Sri Lanka, in Malaysia with the change to Mahathir. It happened in Pakistan with the change from Nawaz Sharif to Imran Khan. Certainly in the Solomon Islands with the unrest. In Pakistan, there's been a series of attacks by Balok militants on Chinese workers. And so China is sort of taking a much more direct interest in protecting overseas Chinese workers and businesses. And of course, this is also, I think, factors into how the Communist Party broadly sees Chinese communities overseas as sort of something where China has a unique responsibility to offer protection. So everything I just talked about, has very little to do with sort of security competition and sort of, new Cold War grand strategy, so to speak. It's really about protecting investments, protecting Chinese citizens. And for Salgavari, it's about having a powerful patron that will take an interest in keeping him in power, which traditionally hasn't been something that China does, right? The Chinese talk a lot about non-interference in international affairs. And, it's not like Russia sort of intervening in Syria to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. Obviously, that's an extreme example, not exactly what's happening here. But China traditionally hasn't done that, especially in relatively far-flung locales like the Solomon Islands. But the other side is that the reaction in Australia, New Zealand, and the United States has, I think, seen this development firmly through a geopolitical lens, which is that this is an area that we didn't really have to think about too hard for a while. And here I say, I'm really thinking of the United States. I think Australia and New Zealand have very much seen this part of the world as much more salient to their interest, given that it's directly in their neighborhood.
And I'll just interject. Sorry to interrupt you, but Australia and New Zealand's had peacekeepers in the Solomon Islands into the 2000s. Solomon Islands had a civil conflict in the 90s and into the early 2000s, and so Australia and New Zealand, certainly more than the United States, have actively been involved in the Solomon Islands, and I think the United States used them sort of as sort of extensions of itself in that realm.
Right. No, I think that's terrific context. I think the bigger picture here is that this uncomfortable dynamic that is now facing the United States, Australia, and New Zealand in the Southern Pacific is, I think, a logical consequence of Chinese power rising and China's interests expanding around the world. China is doing business everywhere. Chinese overseas investment is exploding, and that's, I think, really the dynamic that's led to this. And it's uncomfortable. It's unresolved, and obviously, I think the prospect of a naval base is not something that we can write off, right? Even if it's not in the agreement, it might one day. I mean, when you have this kind of a relationship that begins to deepen, and you have Chinese law enforcement activities picking up, it's not difficult to imagine that in the future that opens the door to the PLA Navy establishing a naval base. So I think that's the primary concern here. But certainly, I think the bigger picture here is that this is what the world begins to look like when China simply grows in its ambitions and its scopes for its overseas activity. This is the sort of thing that people were predicting really in 2012 and 2013 when Xi Jinping came into power and when he spoke in late 2013 in Indonesia and Kazakhstan about the new Silk Road and the maritime Silk Road leading up to the Belt and Road Initiative more broadly, and so this is really I think the bigger picture here. So, should we switch gears, Katie, and talk a little bit about the Australian federal elections?
Yes, we should, because they also feature prominently China.
Exactly, and they're about to happen, and so just. It's probably a good opportunity, actually, Katie, to sort of emphasize the magazine, which covers this in some detail.
Yes. So in the May issue, which came out about 2 weeks ago, but is still fresh and great, we have an article from Natasha Kassam and Jennifer Su, which covers the China narrative within the Australian election. The reason that they focused on this is, both the coalition government led by the Liberal Party and the Labour, the opposition party in Parliament, have both very much focused on China and security issues as sort of central campaign narratives, while at the same time, polling indicates that what most Australians would like their politicians to be talking about are things like climate change and the economy. But the China narrative, and it sort of had certainly earlier in the campaign and into this month, the election is on the 21st, so it's coming up. Kind of devolved into sort of an ugly accusations being traded of each side being sort of bought off by China and each side trying to be stronger on the China issue. While the core issues remain somewhat unaddressed, Australia and China have not had high-level diplomatic contact in 2 years. That is extraordinary for two countries that share a region to have no contact for 2 years at the upper levels is pretty significant. And yet the discussions of policy are not particularly nuanced in sort of what should be done differently. And certainly, I think the election itself, who knows how it's going to turn out, in particular because it's a parliamentary system. So, there's possibilities for the Liberals to lose seats but remain in power through a coalition, or for Labour to be able to form a coalition and take over government. We don't know how that's going to turn out quite yet, and it could take some time, which I think is interesting. I believe Biden will be in, is it Japan and Korea in the coming days, and the Australian leader, whoever that happens to be, is expected to attend. I don't know if we talked about this before, but I don't know if you've looked to see if there's any news on who's going to go, because it's possible Australia doesn't have a prime minister then. All of this to say is that, the China narrative is really powerful in Australia. Almost every issue can kind of be linked back to China in some form or another. But whether either of the major parties or really any of the independents have any new ideas about how to approach China is kind of unclear to me.
Right, and I guess the bigger picture is that in most wealthy democracies, attempts to make elections about national security issues, be it China and Australia or North Korea,
it's usually really difficult.
And it is difficult, because voters care about they care about real estate prices, jobs, inflation, COVID-19, domestic issues. So even though that this the salience of China in the Australian election, I think, is notable because both parties have really sort of leaned into it, and it's going to be interesting to see if this is a broader trend that we begin to see spread around the region.
I think I would just have us end on, yes, they've leaned into it, but they haven't really distinguished themselves very well in having different policies necessarily. So that I think is kind of an interesting pitch. It's sort of a vote for me. I'll do basically the same thing as the other guy. And that's not necessarily refreshing.
Right. Well, yeah, I think the broader trajectory of Australian policy on China is much more likely to see continuity rather than
Mm-hmm.
change. Sort of the recalibration that happened after 2016, 2017 or so, particularly after the 19th Party Congress in China and the significant decline in China Australia relations is likely a long term development. Um,
Absolutely.
but Katie, let's end it there for today. I think you already previewed for listeners what we may end up coming to talk about, depending on what happens, which is Biden's trip to Northeast Asia, to Korea and Japan. We have a huge COVID-19 outbreak now in North Korea. We're going to have a Quad Leaders Summit, and then the Shangri-La Dialogue is coming up. So it's certainly going to be a busy few weeks in Asian geopolitics. But we'll be back to talk about that soon. So thanks for joining me.
Yeah. I look forward to a hot Asian summer.
Absolutely. So for listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with future episodes. If you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do that. It really helps the show. And as always, like I said at the outset, this episode was really based on listener demand. So if you have suggestions for a topic that you'd like us to address on a future episode, please feel free to reach out to either me or Katie, and we'll be very happy to consider that. So thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon.
Thank you.